Hello and welcome to episode 162 of Page One, the Writers' Podcast. I'm Tarek.
I'm Marco, and thanks for joining us on the podcast where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing journeys, find out how they got into the industry, and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. And we've got a great range of past guests there, from authors to screenwriters to comic writers to video game writers and more, so please do go and check our past episodes out if you haven't already. But we've got a great guest this week.
Yeah, we do indeed. We're chatting with the wonderful Juliet E McKenna, who I think I would describe as a powerhouse of an author. Looking at her list of books here, 15 epic fantasy novels. She's written several novellas, countless short stories, and kind of, you know, we're talking sci-fi, steampunk, alternate history.
Yeah.
And you know, putting the writing to one side, she's the judge for Arthur C. Clarke, for the James White Award. She's been shortlisted for the British Fantasy Award and the British Science Fiction Award for Best Novel. You know, pretty impressive resume,
yeah,
I think. When you look
I
at
think
it.
so. Definitely, you know, a very experienced and well-known and well-liked author. And her latest book is The Cleaving, which is a sort of feminist retelling of the Arthurian legend, which is, and we discussed this a bit, you know, it's always interesting revisiting these stories that, you know, have been told a lot of times, and you sometimes wonder, is there a fresh take on this? But obviously there is if you think about it in the right way, as Juliet has.
I mean, it's interesting because we're at that point now where a lot of people are looking back on older works and they're saying, you know, like Roald Dahl's books was the latest one, I think, and people are saying, you know, is it acceptable for the language or the focus or the characters nowadays? And I think there's that debate of, do you censor it, do you edit it, what do you do? And I think this is an interesting technique of saying, you know what, leave it as it is, but we'll do another version of it and focus it. We'll make it a bit more modern, focus it a little bit differently, and it's almost it feels like a whole different book, a whole different story when it's told from a different point of view. Yeah,
absolutely. So we talked to her all about that, and we talked to her, you know, she's got some great advice on sort of what authors should watch out for with book contracts. She tells us about a particularly bad experience she had with a publisher for one of her books as well. So it's a really interesting chat. So we'll get straight into after a quick advert for a writer's notebook. But before we do, I just wanted to remind people that next week, as this episode comes out, that is the first weekend in June, is the Chimera Festival in Edinburgh, science fiction, fantasy and horror festival. Lots of great authors going to that, and we're going to as well.
More importantly, we're going. Exactly. By the authors.
Yeah. And we're doing a live recording of Page One with the brilliant R.J. Barker. So if you are in Edinburgh and you want to come along, then do just head along to the Chimera website and you can get a ticket. You do need a ticket, but it is free. And you can come and watch us speak to R.J. And I think it'll be quite an interesting chat because R.J.
seems like quite an eccentric character.
He's it won't be a cam interview, I don't think, put it that way. But no, we're really looking forward to it, and it'd be great if you want to come along. But we'll get straight into this week's episode now.
On with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it. So we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page 1.
Did you always want to be a writer?
No. I don't think the sort of possibility really ever occurred to me. I've always been a great reader. I learned to read when I was 3 years old, not because I was any sort of child prodigy, but because my older brother is 2 years older than I am. So he started school at age 5. And you know those sort of snapshot memories you have from when you're a little kid?
Yep.
I have a very vivid memory of sitting on the sofa in the lounge with my mum and my brother going through the Ladybird Reading Scheme, Peter and Jane books, and sitting on her other side and sort of peering over to see what was going on, because this looked really interesting. And that's how I learned to read. And back in those days, this being late 60s, early 70s, God, ancient, school libraries and public libraries, you would find books of myths and folklore and legends and fairy stories and the Narnia books and Bill Badger's books and all sorts of fantasy on the same shelves as, you know, R.J. Unsted's History of Britain for Children. So history and fantasy and folklore were all just different aspects of the same fascinating stuff that there was to read as far as I was concerned. But I don't think I actually started to think about writing probably until I was at university. And I actually started creating narrative, if you like, because I started doing Dungeons and Dragons.
Nice.
And I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, and fairly rapidly after that, I started DMing Dungeons and Dragons sessions. And I was playing with a group of people. There are broadly speaking, two different approaches to rules in any sort of gaming, whether I've done live action role playing as well. And you have the people whose attitude is, well, if the rules don't say I can do it, I can't.
Yeah.
And then you have the other sort, which are always the people I've been playing with, whose attitude is, if the rules don't explicitly forbid it, I can give it a go. And when you're dealing with players like that, what tends to happen is you can have constructed a wonderfully intricate, detailed, beautifully crafted session for an evening's gaming, and they'll want to go 180 degrees in the other direction. And they'll have an excellent reason for going 180 degrees in the other direction. And, you know, they will basically lay out all of these excellent reasons such that as the DM, you're thinking, okay. And so they party head south instead of north, which means that if you then have to DM on the fly, you have to have a good solid grounding in your world building. You have to know the broad strokes of what towns are where and the underlying economy and where the bad guys are and where the good guys are and the likely problems that they're going to face, because you can't just have n number of encounters with bandits, because that will make for a very repetitive, boring evening. And when you created a good solid depth and breadth of a world like that, and as I say, the other thing I started doing at university was live action role playing. And again, fairly rapidly, my now husband and I started running our own LARP club with, again, a very detailed, broad-based setting. And different people would write adventures in that, and we'd run weekend events. And you can't really create things like that without, in your idle moments when you're doing the washing up or doing the ironing, stories starting to occur to you. When I started writing them down was when I was quite a bit. I wrote what I was confident was going to be the definitive blockbuster's fantasy masterwork. Absolutely sure of it. You know, my only concern was, you know, if I got two really good offers from different publishers at the same time, gosh, how would I handle that? I was in my early 20s. And I wrote, as I say, the definitive blockbuster fantasy masterwork was what I thought. And if it had ever been published, it would have had been roughly the dimensions and weight and literary merit of a house brick. Because it went the round of agents and editors and came winging back with thanks but no thanks, slightly skewed 19th generation photocopy compliment slips. And this was in the day where, you know, you are talking 500 pages of manuscript thudding onto the doormat.
Yeah.
You know, none of this email malarkey. So, and I sort of, obviously, clearly the world is not ready for my genius yet. And then I had my first child, and I was at home with the boy because I worked in personnel management. And basically, I worked for a national company. It was the sort of job where I could go into work and, you know, have you got your toothbrush in your handbag? Yes, right, good. You need to book yourself a pool car in a hotel because you've got to do disciplinary on Stoke-on-Trent tomorrow morning.
Right, okay.
So, you know, not really suitable job to combine with a small child.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I was at the sort of salary level where if I'd gone back to work, every penny I earned would have gone on childcare.
Yeah.
And bear in mind, this is probably the most fantastic thing you'll hear in a long time. Back in the day, you could run a mortgage on one salary. Yeah. As I say, we're going back a good few years. So basically, rather than work flat out to pay somebody else to raise the child, my husband and I did the family sums, and basically I stopped working. And motherhood is very rewarding and very fulfilling, and can also be incredibly dull. So I was reading library books on a fairly regular basis, and some of them were really not very good. So I started to think, you know, I bet I could do better than this. So I dug out the definitive blockbuster fantasy masterwork and started tinkering with that again. I also, when the boy was about a year old, I got a part-time job in our local branch of Ottakers.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to see how the book trade really works from the inside, from the retail side. And my goodness, that was an eye-opener. That really showed me I really, really needed to up my game. I started to go to hear authors talk at library sessions, library events, things like that. And again, I started basically, because this again is well before the internet, started anywhere I could find out more about the book trade, publishing, writing. You know, I went and found ways to learn this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote another version of the definitive blockbuster fantasy masterwork. And having had our second child, even then working part-time in the book shop became economically unviable. I'd have actually ended up paying £10 a month more than I earned. So I started writing it, and it went out to agents and editors and came winging back. But this time it was coming back with rather different sort of rejection slips, which were saying things like, oh, you know, strengths in the world building, like what you're doing with dialogue, you know, not convinced by the characters, needs more, etc., etc. And one of the scary things is how close that book actually got to being published, because it went to the editorial committee of one of the big publishers, and it got voted down by 3-2.
Oh, very close.
So close, but my goodness, I am so glad, with the benefit of 25 years plus hindsight, that it didn't get through, because that would have been a 2-book deal, and that would have been the end of it. Because when they sent the manuscript back, they sent the readers' reports, and to this day I do not know if that was a genuine error, because writers are never supposed to see them, because they are merciless. Or somebody somewhere in that office thought, you know what, if we give her a really, really short, sharp shot, maybe
that's horrible, isn't it?
She'll buck up her ideas.
In-depth views you don't necessarily ask for, is it?
Well, yeah, but I'll tell you what, it's what I needed. I mean, you know, this is, you know, 30 years ago.
What sort of stuff was this?
There's some of the sentences are burned into my memory. Believe me. Well, again, from one of the earlier rejection slips, when I was actually getting more feedback, one of those had said, There is nothing to distinguish this book from the 6 other perfectly competent fantasy novels that have crossed my desk this week.
Oh, God.
So that was a sort of, okay, I need to think about that one. And the readers' reports were, I say, were absolutely brutal. If the author's lost interest in her central character by about halfway through, why should I carry on? Okay. And the thing is, they were right. And once I'd got over the being terribly upset because they were being so mean, and I'd actually thought, you know what, by the time his younger son was sleeping enough for me to start to feel bored again, I got everything off the shelf and read it, and with a sort of, the perspective that distance lends. I read these things through and I thought, you know what, they're right. And by this time, one of the events I'd been to was a crime writing conference. And there'd been a talk by one of the commissioning editors for one of the big publishing houses in London. And what she was talking about was how every publisher is looking for the same but different. They're looking for books that they can market and sell. And again, having worked in book selling, that made a lot of sense to me, as like so and so and so and so and so, but with something else, something extra, bringing something new to the party, a new twist, a new idea, a new perspective.
That's interesting, because we often get, you often hear that they want something new, but then you hear about people that are trying to take risks or do something different, and it obviously is too different. It's not. Yeah. It's not actually what they're wanting. As you say, they want a slightly different take on something that already exists. Yeah, same but different. Exactly. Yeah.
And at that stage, I was reading a lot of crime fiction. I've always read right across the genres. And this was when the independently minded female private eye was coming to the fore. V.I. Wachowski, Kinsey Mulhone, Kate Brannigan, and I was reading a lot of those. And I thought, you know what? How would that sort of character, a woman who lives life on her own terms and is not defined by her relationships with men, how would that sort of character fare in a classic high fantasy world with, wizards and dragons and dirty work at the crossroads? So I binned the definitive blockbuster fantasy masterwork, and that was quite something to do, and started again with a blank page and wrote the book that ultimately became the Thief's Gamble, which was my first novel published in 1999.
Okay, so you're writing this new book now for the first time, this fresh book, and at what point did you think this is the correct, this feels better, this is the one which I'm going to have success with, or did you think this is just as good? What was your mind at?
With Thief's Gamble?
Yeah.
It felt right from the start.
Okay.
Because I wasn't trying to tick boxes. That was the big mistake that I'd done with the definitive blockbuster fantasy masterwork. I thought I had to write everything that I was reading.
Yeah.
I had to tick the boxes. Whereas once I started writing what became Thief, it flowed much better. It came much more naturally. The more I got into it, the more I thought, you know what, this is going to go somewhere. And I sort of got feedback from friends and family. If you're looking for feedback, these have to be friends and family who will be absolutely and mercilessly honest with you. Because, and
which can be hard to find.
Not in my family. I was sending my sister chunks of the manuscript, and she went on holiday with my mum and stepdad. And my mum, who was an English teacher, sort of started picking up the bits of manuscript. Once Rachel had read a chapter, my mum would pick it up and read it. My mum reads a lot faster than my sister, so she was sort of chivvying her, where's the next bit? And she rang me up and said, it was just like reading a real book. And it's one of those
ultimate compliment.
One of those things you're thinking, cheers. But actually, because knowing my mum and her background, I thought, you know what, if I can sell it as a real book to her, Because I love my mum and all the rest of it, but she's never been anything you do is wonderful, darling. She's always had very high standards for herself. She's always had very high standards for me and the rest of it, my brothers and sister. And I thought, right, actually, you know what? I've probably got something here, because my mum will never kid me along if she doesn't think what I'm doing is worthwhile. Yeah.
And I think I'm right in saying that with that one, you actually ended up finding a publisher. Was it before you had an agent? It was through a contact that you had made. Yeah.
Yes. Basically, I'd left Ottakers by then because of second child. But one of the people I got to read it, to give me an absolutely truthful and honest response, was one of my former colleagues. And she passed it to one of the reps, because this was in the days when reps still visited the shop. He read it and he passed it on to a commissioning editor. Now, on one level, that sounds like, it's not what you can do, it's who you know. But nobody in that chain would have risked their professional credibility if they didn't think the book was up to the required standard. So yes, that's how that got there. And I got offered a contract, and I read the contract, and I didn't sign the contract because having worked in personnel management, I knew contracts, I knew contract law, and also even by then I'd heard of the Society of Authors, who I got in touch with, and I said, about this contract. And they said, yeah, let's talk about that. So when I sent the letter back, I sent back a letter saying, here are the clauses we will add, here are the clauses we will delete, and here are the clauses we will amend. Because one of the biggest mistakes a new writer can make is just signing the first offer that comes along. There are absolute horror stories. Because the vast majority of people in this business are honest and decent. Some of them are better organized than others, but there are sharks and charlatans out there. And anytime you get an offer, you need professional advice. The Society of Authors will give it free. Once you've got a contract clutched in your little sticky hand, that is a good time to approach agents. I mean, I did that later on. But yeah, always get a professional perspective on a contract that you're offered. And hard as it is, always be ready to walk away. Subsequently down the line, I mean, we're talking, I've been in this business for 25 years. Must have been 7 or 8 years ago, I had a new project. I got offered a contract for it. I read it and thought, referred it to the Society of Authors, who went, yeah, no. And so I turned it down, and I can't name and shame that publisher because they're no longer in business.
Right. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
So what was the steps in that led you to sign the deal then? What led you to finding a contract that you were happy with?
Well, basically making sure that the rights and responsibilities were balanced on both sides. The obligations on me and the obligations on them, that what were the expectations on me and the expectations on them were equal and balanced and fair. Because it's a business. Publishers will get away with what they think they can get away with, and part of the business is knowing when to push back and what to push back against, which is things like particularly these days, things like reversion clauses, and royalty rates, and different rates for sort of different formats. I mean, and also reserving as many rights as you possibly can. I mean, the industry has changed out of all recognition in the last 25 years. Though weirdly, I still come across magazine articles and Sunday supplement articles on writing novels for fun and profit, which seem to think that the royalties, the advance and royalties business model, where you get paid an advance and you write the book and you earn out and you get into royalties, and by the time you're on your 6th book and you've sort of built a readership and all the rest of it, then you can think about giving up the day job. That business model is dead as the dodo. But so many other things have arrived in that intervening 25 years. The internet for a start, that it's a very different business. So one of the most important things I think as a writer is always keeping up to date and keeping current with information. There is an awful lot of outdated information out there. So keeping current with the state of the business, the state of the tech is, it's an important thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's true, because it's a strange industry in the sense that if you are starting out, there's a lot of information out there, but at the same time, a lot of it is quite opaque, and there's a lot of gatekeepers in the way as well. So you can find yourself, especially on the internet. Actually, I think we spoke to, it was Ed McDonald who we were speaking to about this, but you can end up getting advice of people that actually have
no
complete
clue.
No clue whatsoever.
Absolutely.
So you've got to be careful from that side of things as well.
Yeah, we're incredibly fortunate in science fiction and fantasy that we have conventions. Because there will always be sessions where writers, we're all happy to talk about this stuff. Mostly because when we were coming up, we listened to other writers talking about this stuff. We benefited from other people's advice, experience, and cautionary tales. There are, we have British Science Fiction Association, British Fantasy Society, Horror Writers Association, Science Fiction Writers of America. I think they're still called that. All sorts of writer beware, fabulous website that every would-be writer should have bookmarked. There are a lot of sources of valid information out there, and the science fiction community being what it is, people are, if you're not sure about something, ask, and chances are people will be able to steer you in the right direction.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that since you got that initial contract, you've been incredibly prolific. You, not just on the novel writing front, you've done sort of novellas, short stories, and not only in that original universe, but also more contemporary fantasy with the Green Man series, and your latest book, of course, which is the retelling of Arthurian legends from a feminist point of view in the Cleaving. Before we get on to the Cleaving, how do you find new ideas to write about? How do you become so prolific in telling these stories?
Ideas are never a problem. There are more ideas than I could write books of in a lifetime. But one of the tricks is identifying which is a short story idea, which is a novella idea, and which is a novel length idea. A novel length idea has to be robust. It has to be intricate's probably not the right word. Multi-layered is probably better. Something, something with a lot of facets. A short story idea can be a D4. A novel idea needs to be a D20. It's basically, I've described this in the past as finding the kicky ideas until they start fighting back. And again, I bounce them off, friends and family. The Lescari Revolution trilogy that I wrote, that idea had been swirling around for years. But I couldn't get a handle. I knew I wanted to write something about, noble rivalry and warfare and dukes competing for the high throne from the point of view of the people getting trampled into the mud. Because again, find a classic idea, but find a new perspective on it. And that was the perspective I wanted to take to that. But I couldn't find, and I bounced ideas off my husband. He's like, no, it's going to be a boring book about peasants covered in mud. Yeah, but what if I did it? No, it's still a boring book about peasants covered in mud. And a few months later, about the Lescari book, what if, no, still a boring story about peasants covered in mud. Until I got the idea of bringing in the exiles, everyone who could leave. This is a country that's got sort of 6 rival dukes, all who want to be high king. So there's this sort of low-level warfare that occasionally erupts into bloodshed and battles. And the dukes are fine because they can tax the peasants and earn money elsewhere. But the ordinary people have got to the point of being mad as hell and decided they're not going to take any more. So how's that going to happen? You have to bring the exiles in. All the people who can leave a situation like that do leave. And that, I started thinking about that, and I ran the idea past my husband, and he said, okay, not a boring book about peasants covered in mud. Let's go. So yeah, basically it has to be an idea that is robust enough to stand up to challenge and detailed examination.
And it sounds from that you're quite a planner rather than a pantser.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, because you kind of have to think through the idea, work out where you go with it to get the idea of, is it robust enough to take this as a full-length book, or is it too short?
Yeah. I mean, I always know the end of a book before I start it. And I mean, that has changed over the years. I still plan. I still start with a sheet of A4 paper and basically rough out the skeleton of the book, where the big beats are, where if it's a book that's going to have a subplot, how that's going to interact. There'll be different lines and colored pencils and all the rest of it. And then I'll break that down further into sections and chapters and write notes and all the rest of it. When I started out, those plans were pages long and very, very detailed. And when I found that I was going down a dead end, I would twist myself into absolute contortions trying to make the idea still fit, even though the way that the world had influenced the characters, had influenced the plot, had influenced the world, because it's a sort of a recursive process as you get deeper into a book. You start to realize there are factors involved that you hadn't necessarily seen to that point. These days, I was been very fortunate in my editors, right from the word go, who, when sort of giving editorial feedback, and the best editors never say this is wrong, but they say things like, could you explain this, because that's not quite working for me, maybe this, so it becomes a collaborative process. And certainly by the time I'd written my first my first 4 books, I had got a much better understanding of realizing when a story was going off track. And on my 5th book, I had my wonderfully detailed plot, and I got about a third of the way through it, and there was going to be a thing, and that was in the outline, and my editor had signed off at it, and we were all perfectly happy with the thing. And then I had a different idea because I thought the thing wasn't going to work, and I rang up my editor and said, Tim, yes, the thing, yes, what do you think about pirates instead? And he thought, if you can make it work, make it work. And by that stage, I had enough experience and enough confidence, and other people had demonstrated sufficient confidence in me that I thought, right, okay, that's the way to go. And so sort of subsequently to that, I am much better at not wasting time pursuing an idea that ultimately isn't going to work. I'll slam on the brakes, stop, pause, think, and find the way I want to go, which is normally more of a challenge in the actual writing, I've found, but always ends up with a better book.
And that's interesting, because when you're giving a pitch or something to a publisher or to an editor, and it sounds like obviously you're giving particularly detailed pitches to them, how open are they to changes? Obviously, he was open to that change there, but if you turned around and said, "Look, I've tried to write this, and it's actually going in a completely different direction. The ending's going to be completely different. Everything's going to be completely different." Will that ever cause an issue for an author?
I can only speak about me and my own experiences, which are generally that editors want to see the best possible book, and if that's going to make for a better book, then they'll be happy. And even editors I haven't worked for, that is very much the vibe I've always got from them. And I think it's one of those things that if you are reliable, consistent, if they know that you have a solid track record of turning out readable books, they'll go with you. One of the things about this business is basically you be professional and be businesslike.
Yeah, I think that's it seems like a very simple point, but I think it's something that is often missed actually. And in that process of, you've got your detailed plans, albeit now you're more open to
Much
sort of
more
stop.
fluid.
Yeah, much more fluid. How does that lead to? What does it lead to in terms of a first draft and revising? Is your first draft quite clean? Do you revise as you go, or does it sort of come together in the revision process?
I do write. I write 2 drafts. I write a first and a final. My first drafts are pretty clean because I start each writing session by reading back what I wrote the previous day, and I'll do a certain amount of tidying up and line editing as I do that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a thing I've been working on today. Yesterday evening, I realised that actually the person, this is the new Green Man book, one person had driven the characters to a place, and actually they really needed to use the other person's car.
Right.
So basically, the session I've done today has been checking that every instance of Land Rover gets changed to Toyota. But also, and that has implications about who's sitting and where in the vehicle, and this, that, and the other. So yeah, my first drafts are pretty clean, but they will need work. They will always need work because the process of writing is so much slower than the process of reading.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And so there will be bits that are overwritten. A long time ago, something I was writing, somebody was traveling on a train from London into the country, into the Cotswolds, and I read this back, and in the course of what I'd written over the course of a week, I mentioned this woman's gloves 4 times. Reading it back, no, we do not need to hear that she's got a pair of gloves on 4 times.
Yeah.
Once is enough. So the process of writing is that much slower. There is inevitably repetition.
Yeah.
One of the things that emerges in the course of writing a book for me are the underlying themes. I don't ever write with a theme in mind because having worked in bookselling, particularly having been the children's section bookseller because I had kids, books with an improving moral message are deathly dull to read, and they must be even worse to write. But underlying themes do emerge through the course of a book. And occasionally you think, I better dial that back a bit. I've been writing a book that involved a fair amount of warfare during one or other of the Gulf Wars, and reading it back, I thought, we don't actually need to know this much about logistics, because it was obviously something I'd had on my mind listening to the news when I'd been writing that particular chapter, and it was just, one of the things that my husband has always been very good at is marginal notes, saying this is boring, why do I need to know it? So there will be things.
I'm loving the bluntness that people around you just give advice.
I'm very fortunate. I am very fortunate. You've got to have a peculiar combination of a thick skin and willingness to listen.
Mm-hmm.
When you're sort of developing your craft skills as a writer. So the final draft, and also as you work through something, you will see connections and things that you think, actually, this thing that happens in chapter 18, there's a thing I can foreground in chapter 3, and people are going to think I'm a genius.
Yeah.
So that's the process for me. And then final draft goes to an editor, and the editor will see things you have not seen, things you have missed. They will see areas that could benefit. They'll see, because you will understand the reasoning. You will know A, B, C, D. All the steps are there. The editor, somebody who is not plugged into your brain, will spot the bits where you're actually going A, B, and straight to D, and C is not sufficiently clear for somebody who is not looking through your eyes.
Yeah.
So then there will be the third pass from editorial feedback, and hopefully by that stage we've got a book.
Speaking of books, the Cleaving is your latest one. A nice little a seamless segue. I thought that was quite good there. And it's out next month, April 2023, time of recording. So why don't you tell us what it's about?
Well, it's an Arthurian retelling that from a female-centered viewpoint. And this arose in a very interesting way because 10 years ago, 20 years ago, if you'd ever asked me, I'm going to write an Arthurian novel, Jules, I'd have said no, because we know the story, we know how it ends, and it's not well. And a couple of years ago now, I was talking to Simon Spanton, who I've not worked for him or with him, but we've known each other through the convention circuit, sat and had chats and all the rest of it. And he got in touch and said, you ever thought about writing an Arthurian retelling, Jules? And I said, no. And he said, particular reason why not? Well, overarching patriarchy, rape culture, dead hand of the toxic masculinity. How many reasons do you want? He said, oh, good. And I said, pardon? And he said, well, do you think you could give us a feminist take on it? Because I am known fairly well in science fiction and fantasy circles for being fairly unapologetically feminist. And I thought, now the timing of this was really interesting because I've been writing The Green Man's Challenge, which isn't a spoiler because it's on the back cover copy, involves giants in British legend. And reading up on giants in British legend, I'd actually been reading a fair amount of the stuff about the Matter of Britain and the Arthurian cycle because it's all interwoven. Mm-hmm. So, if you'd asked me that 2 years previously, I wouldn't have had the same material at my fingertips, which, as I say, it was a very interesting case of timing. And I thought, well, it's an interesting challenge. Maybe I could think about it. And I talked to my agent, Max, and he said, yeah, that's an interesting challenge. What do you think about it? So I went and looked back at some of the source material that I had read recently and some of the source material I hadn't, particularly Mallory, Mort Dartha, however you're supposed to pronounce that, never been sure, and started looking at the women in the narrative and realised that in most of the retellings, of which there have been many, and I have read and watched a great many of them, the women only come in and out of the narrative to be a piece of plot, to cause a piece of plot, and they go off stage again, presumably to go and sit in a box. And when I started putting together some timelines of where these female characters were and when, I started to see when and how they would overlap. And when and how different aspects of the core narrative would impact these women's lives, even though that was never normally centered in the stories that we are so familiar with. And so the more I looked into it, the more interested I got. So I put together some ideas and sent them to Simon. And he came back with, oh, this sounds really interesting. Do you think you can write it? And I said, yes, because by that stage, I really wanted to.
Mm. And when you're, I mean, you've sort of touched on it a bit there, but when you're writing a story in such a well-trodden, area of storytelling, does that help or hinder? There's a lot of stuff there that you can take that the readers will come into it with some knowledge, which you can either take advantage of or subvert in some way or something like that. But that could also potentially constrain you in some way.
Yes, it cuts both ways because you got the structure of the narrative we all know. Arthur is going to go from Arthur being born at Tintagel to bloody slaughter at the field of Camlan. Mm-hmm. That's a given. Between then, even when you go back to the original sources, there are huge numbers of variations on the myth. Is Nimue an independent character in her own right, or is that the name of the Lady of the Lake, or is the Lady of the Lake actually called Vivian, or what? Because there are all these different variations on the different themes. There are different versions of Morgana's story, so many of those. Mm-hmm. And so I started to see actually there was quite a lot of scope in putting together a rounded, psychologically robust and convincing character for the four women I picked to carry the story through, which is Nimue is a character who's throughout the book, and she is magical.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is Igraine, Arthur's mother, who I have always thought has had really shabby treatment. Morgana, who's had some fairly iffy treatments.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Guinevere, who's a challenge because she's a good girl who inexplicably goes bad. And again, a lot of that in the retellings, what's going on there gets really fudged or glossed over.
Mm-hmm.
So putting together convincing narratives for all of these characters from the female point of view, because one of the things about women, we talk to each other. We talk to each other and we cooperate. That's why we're so dangerous. And so as I sort of put together all of these ideas, actually the story it had that breadth and that depth and that unexpected perspective
Mm-hmm.
that is crucial to anything I'm going to write, as far as I'm concerned. Then it did get a bit stickier the closer I got towards the end, because I knew the end point. Yes, I always know the end point to a book, but this was not the end point I had chosen. It was an end point that was chosen for me by the constraints of the narrative. And normally, as I'm writing a book, I'm heading towards the end. And these days, again, this is going to be my 24th novel. I've been doing this a while, and I have learned to trust the process, so that I will, even if I haven't these days necessarily got see how all the pieces fit together, by the time I arrive there, I will see that.
Yeah.
And with this book, I was getting closer and closer and closer to the end and thinking, with all due credit to John Borman and all reverence and respect, the Battle of Camlan had to be something more than a field of bloody slaughter. Otherwise, you can't end the book on that. So where's the interesting twist going to come? And any time now would be good. And any time, yes, really. And I was much, much closer to the end of this book when suddenly everything went click, 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 click into place than generally. And I must say that was a huge relief. And I must say I am also extremely pleased with the way that everything suddenly came together.
Mm-hmm.
It was like one of those sort of puzzle boxes.
Mm-hmm.
Where you move something and suddenly everything clicks into place.
Yeah.
At which point you think, ha, I'm a genius. Well, people are probably going to think I'm a genius or not, but it's very, very satisfying when that happens. So it was a very interesting creative exercise. And actually, it was interesting because my relationship to this book, I'm very proud of it. I worked very hard on it, but it's not, I don't want to say my baby, because that sounds twee and that's not me.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not my own original creation. It's my perspective on a piece of universal cultural history. In that sense, it was much more like writing for something like Doctor Who or Star Trek or Star Wars, because you're working in a tradition that a lot of people have worked on, and you're giving your own perspective on it. It is quite I have a different emotional relationship to this book than I do to things that are entirely of my own creation.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
And do you think that, looking at the wider genre, over the last few years, we've seen fantasy and sci-fi perhaps have a kind of wider acceptance or a wider readership, and maybe moving away from that kind of niche, judgy part of the literary spectrum it once sat on. Is it more accepted? Is it more read?
It depends who you're talking to. The literary establishment are still incredibly snobby about it. Yeah, try getting on a literary festival program. Who cares? We have the convention circuit. People are keen. Film and TV adaptations have done wonders for the genre.
Yeah.
Bringing it to the mainstream and showing that actually you can have deep, complicated, complex, psychologically intriguing narratives that also have wizards and dragons.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
and so, yeah, there are some brilliant things out on the screen which have brought fantasy to a much bigger audience. The other thing that we've got going on is, when I started reading, fantasy in the late 70s, early 80s, it was post-Tolkien formulaic. And that was fine because the genre was sort of finding its feet and seeing where it could go. And then you got the likes of David Gemmell coming in and ripping up that rule book. And other writers followed in that tradition, and women writers started following in that tradition. You had Melanie Rawn, Elizabeth Moon, and so genre solidified, got its house in order and became a good, solid, robust genre. And what's happened recently is it's expanded again in all directions. You've got people from many different cultures writing, drawing on their own literary traditions, whether that's Malaysian. You've got writers like Zen Cho. You've got African sources of inspiration, Native American sources of inspiration, Middle Eastern sources of inspiration. And these are all working with the classic fantasy themes, but bringing a whole new set of ideas and settings and characters and monsters and a whole new set of perspectives, which has enriched and broadened the genre out of all recognition, which I think is absolutely fantastic. The other thing that's going on is we're starting to interrogate the origins of the genre. You've got people writing books looking back at folklore, because everybody thinks fantasy started with Tolkien. Well, yeah, but no, because actually the genre's got its roots in the popular literature of the Victorian period. You've got things like Jules Verne and Edith Nesbit, and she was, strictly speaking, Edwardian. But also things like H. Rider Haggard and King Solomon's Mines, all of that adventure sensation literature. Which, a lot of it doesn't bear rereading because, oh dearie me. The Arthurian cycle, again, is something that people are looking at. And I think it enriches the genre because we're starting to look at those sources critically. One of the reasons that I wrote this book, and one of the reasons I found this book so interesting to write, was a lot of the classic cliches, if you will, the white knight on his horse and the damsel in distress, have been carried through from a lot of these epic tales of high adventure and not necessarily interrogated. And interrogating the influence of the Arthurian myth on epic fantasy was actually one of those things that emerged through the course of writing this book that I found increasingly interesting. I think the genre's in a really good place at the moment.
Nice.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I just wanted to touch on the fact that as well as writing, you've sort of spoken about this earlier on, but you're very embedded in the writing scene. You attend conventions and festivals, and you've judged some of the biggest prizes, World Fantasy Awards, Arthur C. Clarke Awards, and things like that. And first, how on earth do you find the time while also doing the writing that you do? But also, is it important, in your view, for more experienced writers to go to these things and interact with the sort of up and coming writers and help the next generation of writers develop?
The way you manage judging a competition is it helps if you read insanely fast, which I do, because I started learning. I learned to read when I was 3. And I did a very, very intensive reading intensive degree course. So I read very, very fast. Also, when you're judging a competition, you have to ruthlessly triage.
Yeah,
which is basically, my process was sort the books into likely contenders, probably not a contender, but definitely interesting.
Yeah.
Probably not going to make the grade, dregs and duffers. Everything got looked at, everything gets looked at, but by the time I'm into the probably not box, I'll give a book 100 pages to convince me to carry on reading. Okay. Some of them I get about 50 pages in and no. Others of them, I'll get to 100 pages and think it's not going to make the list, but it's a cracking read, so I'll put that to one side and come back to it later. It's important, I think, to have a finger on the pulse of what the genre is doing and where the genre is going. Yeah. And that's one of the things you get from conventions. Even if you don't read books by everybody you hear speaking, you get to hear what people are thinking and the trends. You get to hear what readers are interested in, what readers are looking for, all of which is useful. You know, it's also grist to the mill. I have always found it very productive, very rewarding. And I don't think I've ever been to an event where I haven't heard something that has solved a problem for something I'm currently working on. As far as writers giving back and helping younger readers, sort of aspiring writers rather. Yes and no. I mean, I'm always happy to talk about my process. But I don't ever expect anyone to think I am telling them the way they must do it.
Yeah.
I have studied since 1983. I've studied martial art called Aikido, and Aikido is interesting because it's not a competitive martial art. Everybody trains together. You are improving your skills, and the only person you're measuring yourself against is yourself. So basically, all grades, all ages, all heights, weights, and the rest of it, we all train together. Now, if I go to a class, I go to a demonstration, and a young, fit, 20-something, 6'4" black belt is explaining his take on a particular technique, I will look at that and I will think, I am not a young, fit, 20-something, 6'4" male black belt. I am a nearly 60-year-old, 5'6", grey head, wearing glasses, lady black belt. So I will look at what he's doing, and the bits that I can see of his technique that I can use, that I can adapt, that will improve my Aikido, those are the bits I'll take out from that course. The bits that aren't relevant to me, maybe will be relevant to other people. Great. That's the whole point of hearing what other people do, seeing what other people do, seeing these things demonstrated and explained. So I'm gravely suspicious of anybody peddling, this is the way to fame and fortune writing, follow my roadmap, pay me a lot of money, and I promise you success. Because that's just not how it works. When you're learning to write, when you're honing your craft skills, some things will come naturally, some things you will find more difficult. So basically, for me personally, I get as many perspectives on something as I can, and I find the bits that resonate with me, those are the bits I can use and add to my own skill set.
I think it's. I suppose I was more asking, being open to questions and stuff from aspiring authors rather than saying this is how you should. I'm always happy to answer questions. Occasionally it'll be, nobody's ever asked me that before. Let me have to think about that. And I may or may not come back with a coherent answer. But it's always interesting to find out what people want to know. Absolutely. And as well as fantasy, you mentioned earlier that you read across genres. You're quite an avid, I think, crime and thriller reader.
Yeah.
Would you ever want to write a completely straight thriller or crime novel like that?
Well, I have written 3 murder mysteries set in classical Greece. They are Shadows of Athens, Scorpions in Corinth, and Justice for Athena, I think, is the third one. And that they're written as J.M. Alvey, Alvey.
Okay.
And that was one of those instances where it became a hideous cautionary tale of everything that can go wrong in publishing. And it was the sort of experience which, if I'd had that experience when I was setting out, I probably would have given up completely, because the project lost 2 editors inside 6 months due to corporate reorganization. What I was being told and what was actually going on turned out not to tally at all. Same with what my agent was being told, and what was actually going on turned out not to tally at all.
Oh.
And basically, the whole mess, it got to the point where the whole mess was kicked upstairs to somebody I'd never even spoken to, who cancelled the whole project 6 weeks before the second book was published.
Oh God!
What a nightmare.
It was an absolute screaming nightmare. I have never been so close to just quitting writing completely.
Uh-huh.
If I hadn't also been writing the Green Man books at the same time, which were getting increasingly popular and people were very keen to read the next one, yeah, I would have thrown up my hands and walked away. One of the perspective of having been in this industry for such a long time, as I say, I signed my first book contract 25 years ago. Over the years, I've had bad luck. Everybody has bad luck. Bad timing happens. Pro tip, don't have a book come out the week Borders goes bankrupt. And occasionally, very occasionally, very rarely, you find yourself dealing with somebody who's dealing with you in bad faith. When all of those things collide, it's catastrophic, and that's what happened there. But that's not the end of the story, thanks to the miracles of modern technology, because that was a 2-book deal. As I say, they binned the entire thing. Somebody I'd never even spoken to binned the entire thing 6 weeks before the second book was due out. I have subsequently learned that they slashed the print run, and it's a whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
But when the dust settled, because I was able to point to bits of my contract and say, seriously? When the dust settled, I got all my rights back in a year. And so my agent then sold the ebook rights for the first 2 books to a different publisher, ebook only. I wrote a 3rd book because I'd already had it planned, and they put that out as well. Due to the absolute shambles that the first publisher made of this project, that's been an uphill struggle. I mean, they're selling quite well, and people are enjoying them hugely and want to see more of them. We haven't yet reached the point where it's worth any. We haven't reached the tipping point where that publisher's come back to me and said, "Okay, let's have another one." But you never know. And even 10 years ago, that couldn't have happened.
Yeah.
But ebook direct publishing now means that even when things do go catastrophically wrong, as a writer, you have opportunities to salvage things from the wreckage. But yes.
And so we've got the Cleaving coming out next month, and then what is next in the pipeline? You said you were working on another Green Man.
I'm working on another Green Man book because I had a really interesting idea about throwing up a whole new set of challenges for Dan, our titular character, our central character in there. So I'm having great fun with that at the moment. As well as that, I'm genuinely not sure. One of the things about writing the Cleaving was I got back to good old swords and sorcery, which is where I started out with the Thief's Gamble. Magic swords and shenanigans and creepy magic and things like that. And I've had such great fun writing that maybe it's time to go back to that for a bit. Don't know. We'll see.
Nice. Excellent. What was the last book that you read?
Well, I am in the middle of reading Furious Heaven by Kate Elliott, which is completely fantastic. And before that, I read one or other of the Lee Child Jack Reachers just as a disengaged brain and past the popcorn read.
Yeah.
And what about the last film that you watched?
That would have been Black Panther, Wakanda Forever.
Oh, yeah. What were your thoughts on that?
I thought it was interesting. I don't tend to be hypercritical about these things because I don't think they're designed to bear the weight of detailed criticism that sometimes people impose on them.
Yeah.
I thought it was very well done. And I, as a stepping stone from the very, very difficult situation for the writers
absolutely.
manage. I mean, the loss of Chadwick Boseman is just absolutely horrendous.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested to see what happens next with that. It was a good, entertaining movie because I didn't demand anything more of it than that.
Yeah, we've got a sensible approach.
And what about the last TV show that you watched or are watching?
We're currently working our way through season 19 of NCIS. Again,
All right.
at the end
okay,
of the
nice.
day,
Easy
disengage
watching.
brain,
Yeah.
disengage brain, and pass the popcorn. The best thing I've watched recently was Andor.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that
That
was
was
good.
fantastic.
astonishing.
Yeah.
That
Yeah, it
was
really was.
absolutely
Yeah.
superb.
Yeah.
And the thing that absolutely hit me squarely between the eyes was, we're so used to seeing Andy Serkis, king of mocap
Mm.
with different people's faces. You forget actually what a
He's brilliant.
outstanding good
Yeah,
actor he
it's
is
fantastic.
when he's able to wear his own face.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
mean, that I am so looking forward to seeing what they do next with that.
Yeah, no, I thought it was
I thought
brilliant.
that was superb.
Very kind of adult sci-fi. Didn't explain stuff, just kind of went with it, and all the better for it.
Yeah.
And the very, very last thing we do, super quick fire, either or. And I always say there's no right answer here apart from one. But we'll start off with Terry Pratchett or Robin Hobb.
Oh, that's horrible. Robin Hobb.
Fair enough.
Okay.
That is evil. I've probably got more books by those two writers than anyone else.
TV or cinema?
TV these days.
Night Owl or Early Bird?
Night Owl. I can work as late as I need, but don't try and expect sense out of me before 9 o'clock in the morning.
Music or no music when you're writing?
Oh, no music at all. The only time I have music on is if there's something like roadworks going on outside.
Yeah.
But I need a closer noise to ignore.
Yeah.
Any time I've had music on with lyrics, they've ended up in the book.
And the last one, real book or ebook?
Either or.
I mean, if you had to pick one, got a gun to your head, and you've got to give me an answer.
Well, I just point out I am a third dan black belt. I'd take the gun off you. Ebook. If it absolutely had to be one or the other, ebook. Because basically, I've got 200 odd things queued up waiting to be read on my tablet. And there is no more room in the house for any more books.
It's one of the many reasons why ebooks are just fantastic.
Yeah.
I agree.
Great.
We have as many books in this house as it is possible for this house to hold.
Well, thanks very much to Juliet for coming on there. And, I thought it was interesting that even an author as experienced and lauded as Juliet could have the sort of bad experience that she had with that publisher in relation to the crime novels that she'd written. And, it just goes to show, I suppose, how carefully you need to be when, looking at contracts and selecting your publisher, because I think, especially for new authors, any publisher that's offering you a deal, you'll be desperate to take it. And as she said there in relation to contracts, sometimes you need to be prepared to walk away if it's not right for you.
I mean, we've certainly chatted about this before. I guess more akin to leaving an agent, I suppose, but that kind of feeling of, as you say, you jump through all the hoops for years, and then someone waves a thing in your face and says, "Here's your key," and you jump at it and you don't want to let it go because it's taking you so long to get there. And I think sometimes you're blinded by that, but you absolutely, you have to do what's right for you, and if that means walking away, that means walking away.
Yeah, I think that's right. But as we said at the start, Juliet's latest book, The Cleaving, is now out. So we'll put a link in the podcast description so you can pick that and her other books up. But thanks again to Juliet for coming on to the podcast. And next week, we've got another great guest on the podcast. Yeah,
next week we're chatting with the awesome Nick Harkaway, who has written a number of really interesting kind of speculative, sci-fi, thrillery, political, weird, really interesting kind of cross genres. Exactly the word I'm looking for. His latest book is Titanium Noir, and it's a futuristic crime thriller, that kind of noir feel, but in a futuristic setting. It's really cool, and it's a really interesting chat, and he's got a lot of really, really good advice and insight into the industry. Yeah, no, it is. It was a really good chat, and I'm really enjoying Titanium Noir. I'm reading it just now.
really sort of cyberpunk noir type idea almost going on there. So yeah, it's a great chat, so please do tune in for that one. If you've enjoyed this episode or any of our previous episodes, please do take the time to rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. Give us a rating, give us a thumbs up if you're listening to this on YouTube, subscribe, follow, all of these things. That helps us to continue to get great guests on the podcast.
Absolutely. And if you want to get in touch, there are a number of ways to do that now. 1, Twitter. You can reach us by sending a tweet in the Twitter machine to @UKPage1. You can send us an email to podcast@rightgear.co.uk. You can catch us on Mastodon, which is writing.exchange/@page1pod, or you can check out our YouTube channel @page1podcast, and you can watch our videos and you can leave us a little comment there.
Absolutely. And if you want to give us a question to ask RJ at our live recording at Chimera next week, then please do that. I'm not promising we'll ask your question, but we'll certainly read it and see if it's safe to ask.
It's less work for us to have to do. I'm happy to take
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. Whatever the question.
Yeah.
But otherwise, have a great week, and we'll speak to you next episode.
See you later.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is @UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.